Next news story of the week. We're actually late to this one, but a few weeks back, Mark Cerny actually gave an interview to GamesIndustry.biz, which was effectively almost like a retrospective on his entire career in the run up to his 60th birthday, which is quite remarkable. And lots of insights in there, and some interesting points being made about the relationship between sort of developers and PlayStation 5 and the way that the resources of the PS5 have been deployed, and also the relationship between PlayStation 5 and PC. John, the headline here is essentially that Mark is surprised at how many games are targeting 60 frames per second, but also how many are targeting ray tracing, which he seemed to believe would only sort of come to the fore later on in the generation. I'm curious what you make of these comments.
I was fascinated by that as well, because he does genuinely seem surprised by some of this stuff, as if I don't know. I mean, as a designer of the hardware, I would assume that because they have to talk to a lot of developers and studios during the creation of a console, right? So you kind of get a feel for what developers want. How can they help them create the box that they want to work with, which I think they've done. And last generation, we saw, especially with the Pro and the Xbox One X, there was a push to try to get more games to 60 FPS, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'm not, and it was usually the CPU that was the major bottleneck then. So with the changes they made, I guess the fact that he's surprised that there's more games at 30 frames per second, I am a little bit confused by that. But I guess when you look at the comment here, he says, just because the artwork can be so much more detailed if you have longer time to render it, right? Instead, the almost universal rule this time around has been 60 FPS. And I think what's actually happening is that we've reached almost a bit of a PS2-like moment, in the sense that to go beyond the point where you need to massively decrease the frame rate, it's not so much that the hardware is the limiting factor anymore. It's just the creation of the assets and the time to build this stuff. And there's so many other things that go into making a game that, like, if you're pushing the graphics that hard when it's well optimized, it takes a lot of work to make something so detailed that, oh, you got to render it at 30 now, right? Like, I think Unreal Engine 5 is the point where we're starting to see more games drop down there. But even then, there's still a lot of 60.
Right.
I think it's more like with PS3 and even PS4 era, the hardware was a gigantic bottleneck for hitting 60 FPS. But I think now, with what most developers can create in terms of the types of games and the types of visuals they can build, 60 FPS is extremely doable, like across the board, kind of like it was on PS2, where it's like, you know, they were doing that level of graphics, and it was like, well, we can do this. This is what we are capable of making, and most of the time they were able to get to 60.
So you're like saying, almost in a really interesting way, that gameplay types that are easy to produce in a certain amount of time are now actually achievable at 60, whereas before the PS3 just couldn't do it at 60, like some sort of gameplay type, right? Almost.
Which is why if you look at 60 FPS PS3 games, they typically skewed older, more retro style. I mean, Ridge Racer 7 is just, it's Ridge Racer, right? But they were able to do 1080p 60. But something like Motorstorm, with all the physics simulation stuff and the mud and those crazy environments, no way they were going to be able to achieve that concept at 60 FPS on that hardware. And then the birth of big open world stuff. You look at Assassin's Creed and like, everybody wanted to do real-time shadows and all this lighting and large open worlds. And like, getting that at 60 was super, 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 super difficult. I mean, we saw some examples that kind of did it, like Burnout Paradise, Driver San Francisco, where they made certain choices to get to 60, but most games like that, no way they were going to do it. Now, all of those game types, all the typical game types, can definitely hit 60, and even 120 in some cases. It's only, it's only now that we've gotten into the more advanced ray tracing stuff and some of those other features of Unreal Engine that it's really starting to push, like, maybe this is less feasible now. But even then, we do have ray tracing games that run at 60. So
and we had ray tracing games at launch,
we did.
Which was a fact that was also surprising to Mark Cerny. There are some things that have kind of confirmed what you might call existing lore about the PlayStation 5, specifically that the RT features were added very late. I mean, we kind of know this because we know developers who had dev kits with which didn't have RT silicon. Alex, what do you think about the ray tracing side of things? I mean, Mark was surprised that we had ray tracing appearing on launch titles. And I guess to a certain extent, I mean, it was great to see stuff like Marvel's Spider-Man and whatnot. But I do think that probably thanks to NVIDIA, ray tracing was a thing for many developers anyway.
Yeah, I think for this, if there wasn't the existence 2 years beforehand of something to just prototype RT concepts on in an easy way, I think that would have made it so that launch was hard, because by that time there were already papers out there about, oh, we made Battlefield 5 with ray tracing, or NVIDIA had papers out about like ray tracing performance and stuff. So a lot of really quick, easy bottlenecks and gotchas were already elucidated in text, and people could read like, oh, okay. So the fact that based upon the research that had already been done, that they could start adding it even to different hardware, which, AMD for PlayStation 5, I think that helped a lot. And I think that's maybe one thing Mark in this comment here just wasn't thinking about at the time. But another thing that I kind of also think really helps is the API standardization, where with ray tracing you have DXR, and the Sony side, and on Xbox side, Sony actually has something that's very similar to DXR, and then they have a low level stuff too. And just like Microsoft has on Series X, they have DXR, but then they also have like really low level stuff you can do with the ray tracing if you want. And I think that DXR like standard, like any kind of start to new hardware features really helps. It's limiting in terms of programmability. It's limiting potentially as a result of that in terms of performance. But it really gets everyone kickstarted to do it. And I think this is the first time in a really long time where ray tracing's simple API has really helped it be broadly adapted, in spite of all the issues that causes. I think I cannot even think of another similar DX period where, other than maybe like DX7, like where everyone's like, okay, all of a sudden everything's going to use hardware transform and lighting. And that was also pretty limiting in terms of what you could do with DX7, but everything started using it really quickly. And it just, I think John can even talk about this. Like everything was all of a sudden DX7, like everyone wanted it. It was a performance boost. And here you can see it visually on screen. And I think developers really, really wanted to get into it finally, because it's been so long in coming. So the one thing I'm just kind of surprised about is that we just got the performance so high so quick, because it's not easy to get right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's other comments in this interview which I found fascinating, specifically that he doesn't view the PlayStation 5 as a low-cost PC as such. They have the scope to basically do whatever they want within that design. I mean, they kind of are low-cost PCs on a surface level, but, you look at what they're doing with the SSD, and they over-engineered a system there. Well, I say over-engineered. They produced a system there which basically gives developers, extremely fast access to data. And I would say that based on the fact that there's kind of few examples where that's a palpable advantage over the Xbox system, which doesn't really have as bespoke a system, where, I think that's an area of the PS5 that's ripe for, further utilization. And we've also seen, of course, in the PC ports that, the PlayStation 5 storage system can outperform PC at its very best, even with direct storage. I mean, Mark's talking here about how some of the stuff in PS5, specifically the storage, may have spurred on direct storage, for example. But, it's still the fact that the PlayStation 5's storage system is really, really good. He was also talking, something which I found quite interesting here is he did actually, I think, name check Linus Tech Tips with their PlayStation 5 killer $500 PC that outperformed the console but he does point out that they needed to get a used motherboard to hit that price point, which I think it just highlights. I mean, when you look at what the PlayStation motherboard is these days, the systems that are on it, the chips that are on it, it is a very, very simple setup, but it's highly capable. So this was a really nice interview. Any further thoughts based on that, Alex?
Just in regards to the PC price thing, I think I can't even remember historically. It's only like when you get to like the really edge, like, I don't know, like PS4, like a little bit after PS4 launch, and like at some point in the Xbox 360's timeline where the cheapness of the component to get a better experience was really, really reasonable. And I think nowadays, due to the rising, process costs on the production side and all these other things, and inflation, it's more challenging. So now I think if you're worried about this, which I'm not, but I think a lot of people just really like talking about it, is, you have to be emphasizing other aspects. Like you were just saying, like with the motherboard there, the PlayStation 5 motherboard literally only does like one thing.
Everything.
And it has, everything in a box. What is that? It's an advertisement.
It only does everything.
It only does everything. But it has like one slot to drop an SSD in. And like a PC motherboard's got all this, extraneous things, know what I mean? It's a very different cost there associated with it. It'll be interesting to see what happens though. So I think when you get a PC, has the ability to do all these other things, which are added into that cost. You always have to think about. But I'm very curious what happens when these Strix, I always forget, Strix Point.
Yeah.
What is it? Strix Point SoCs come out, because they're gonna be a lot more console-like. In terms of what you can do. The lack of upgradability and RAM's going to be a big part. Most likely, I imagine there's going to be stripped down versions that will lack a lot of things like plug and play things that you get on a normal motherboard. So I'm curious to see what the price of those are, as well as their performance vis-a-vis the PlayStation 5.
Well, the Strix, I think it will just follow the existing model. You'll get laptops, of course, which are historically unupgradable.
Right.
You can put in new storage. And then that same chip will become an AM5 CPU, just as Phoenix did. And it would just slot into existing motherboards. I don't think there's going to be any major changes there. There might be some specialist ones. I think the more interesting Strix thing, which we haven't really seen much exposure for yet, is the big APU, the one that's going to have 40 compute units.
Mm-hmm.
How that is going to work, I'm really going to be interested, because we are looking at a very PS5 like design at that point, and I'm just interested to see how much power it's going to consume, how much performance it's going to have, and where we're going to see that APU. That might be the one where you probably get some bespoke motherboards. I'm not sure.
I would imagine. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, really interesting interview. We've only just sort of caught up with it because it was happening in a crazy a pseudo E3 period. But it's really nice to get some more insights from Mark Cerny there. But he does continue to say that as long as they can package up all of this innovation into a cost, efficient unit and get it out there, he still sees a future for consoles. Going back to some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier about 60 frames per second and RT, I think there's been a change in plans, or rather, well, let's put it this way. When I first saw Mark to talk about PlayStation 5, Sony were really wedded to the idea of a generational leap. And instead we had effectively 2.5, 3 years of cross-gen. And cross-gen was a big enabling factor for 60 frames per second. If you've got to run a game at 30 on the PlayStation 4, then it's, a logical step to run it at 60 on PlayStation 5. And you've got overhead left over. So you can do stuff like ray tracing. And then the whole concept of what constitutes a 4K image for a 4K display doesn't actually need to be 4K, freeing up GPU resources, which opens the door to stuff like ray tracing, right? So, yeah, I think it's just the existing, the landscape, as it were, for developers once PlayStation 5 arrived may have been slightly different than envisaged. But I think it's great that, first of all, when Marvel Spider-Man came out, you had that RT mode, and then it didn't actually take too long until you had that combination of 60 frames per second and RT. And then that sort of moved on to Marvel Spider-Man 2, where, they didn't need to have the non-RT mode anymore. I think that's just been fantastic.